like a heartbeat she once knew by instinct. Jessica stood, stepping out onto the porch just as the old army green pickup truck rumbled to a stop by the gate. The driver's side door creaked open, and a tall woman climbed out. Broad-shouldered, purposeful. Every step was deliberate, the kind of stride that didn't know hesitation. The morning light caught the cropped, dark brown hair and the faint scar running from her left temple down across her cheekbone. Marks Sarah Brooks never bothered to hide. Jessica recognized the smile instantly, the one that had steadied her through long nights on watch, through close calls when they'd sprinted out of kill zones with seconds to spare. "Jess!" Sarah called out, her voice still carrying that low, husky rasp, but softened now as some of the dust of war had finally settled. "You gonna open the door for a guest or what?" Jessica didn't answer. She closed the distance in 3 strides and threw her arms around Sarah, holding her tight without a word. They stood there for a moment, silent. The kind of silence between soldiers who had made it home, against all odds, and didn't need to say what survival cost them. Later they sat on the porch steps, hands wrapped around mugs of steaming black coffee. Sarah let her gaze wander across the property, taking it in with the kind of slow, measured understanding of someone who knew what it meant to need a place to come back to after the war. "Emily told me what's been going on," Sarah said after a while. There was no pity in her tone, just the familiar authority of a squad leader. "Figured it was time I showed up." She said it was like a mission assignment, non-negotiable. Jessica gave a faint laugh, rare and unexpected. "You always did know the timing," she said. But deep down she was grateful. Sarah wasn't just an old teammate. She was one of the few who understood Rex wasn't just a dog. He was a soldier, one who'd taken wounds deeper than most humans could bear. Sarah hadn't come alone. She brought Kane with her, a Belgian Malinois, his golden tan coat sleek, his dark eyes sharp, his movements sure. Kane had served in their same unit, once saving Sarah's life, when an explosion nearly killed them both. He was no longer a frontline war dog, but he was still Sarah's protector, her anchor through the darkest parts of her recovery after discharge. PTSD, sleepless nights, the ghosts they both carried. Kane sat quietly beside Sarah, alert but calm, his gaze sweeping the perimeter before settling on Rex, who stood a few meters away. Rex didn't growl, didn't retreat like he used to. His ears were up, his body tense, but watchful, not panicked. Sarah raised a hand, signaling Kane to stay. Then she turned to Jessica with a faint smile. "He still remembers how to read signals," she said. "Now we remind Rex how to do the same." That afternoon, out on the sun-baked dirt yard behind the house, Jessica and Sarah began running through old drills, familiar commands from their deployment days, exercises designed to rebuild trust, to re-establish the bond between soldier and dog. They started with the basics. Focus. Getting Rex to hold eye contact with Jessica, to stay connected, silent, waiting for the next cue. Simple moves, but in war, they'd made the difference between life and death. At first, Rex resisted. His eyes flicked away, his muscles tightened as if ready to bolt. Once, he even turned his back as though ready to leave altogether. But Sarah didn't push. She stayed close by, steady as ever, giving Jessica a slight nod and short, firm reminders. "Patience, Jess. He doesn't need a commander. He needs a teammate." And slowly, it worked. Nearly an hour in, after countless repetitions and quiet commands spoken in Jessica's calm, even tone, Rex lifted his head. His golden gaze locked onto hers. Just for a moment. Jessica didn't overreact. She didn't smile or reach out too soon. She held the connection, steady as if it were a rifle at the line, firm and controlled. "Good," she whispered. "Good, Rex." For the first time since they'd reunited, his tail moved. Not a wag of excitement, but a signal. He was ready to take another step forward. Sarah gave a rare grin. Kane stood and walked over, settling quietly beside Rex, his body language easy. As if saying, "This place is safe. We are safe." That night, when Jessica closed her training notebook and glanced across the living room floor, Rex was stretched out beside Kane, relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in years. She saw it then, not just in Rex's eyes, but in herself. Trust was returning, slowly. And this time, it wasn't just about surviving. The next morning, Sarah packed up to leave. Before climbing into her truck, she pulled Jessica into a firm, long hug, the kind you give a teammate before heading out on an op. "Every wound needs time," Sarah said, "but none of them last forever. You saved Rex, now let him save you." Jessica stood on the porch long after the truck disappeared down the dirt road. She ran a hand down Rex's back as he sat beside her, watching the horizon the same way she did. And she knew Sarah was right. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. The next morning, before the sunlight had time to dry the dew clinging to the weathered wooden fence behind the house, Jessica was already standing in the yard, focused in a way she hadn't realized she was still capable of after so many years of feeling lost. Sarah was there too, silently adjusting Kane's leash at his collar, occasionally glancing at Jessica out of old habit, as she always did before the start of a training session. No words were needed. There was always an unspoken understanding between them, the kind forged by soldiers who had stood shoulder to shoulder at the edge of life and death. Now, they shared a different front line, the battle against the invisible wounds war had left behind. Rex sat a few meters away, body tense, ears pricked forward, his deep golden gaze locked on Jessica's every movement. There was no longer confusion in his eyes, like there had been in those early days. Kane's presence seemed to give Rex a different kind of reassurance, as if seeing another soldier who had found peace with his scars permitted him to try. Jessica tightened her grip on the training whistle in her calloused hand. Her fingers trembled once before she lifted it to her lips and blew 2 sharp bursts. The dry, piercing sound cut through the cold morning mist. Rex flinched, his legs shifting instinctively, but this time he didn't bolt or retreat. He stayed in place, his eyes blinking quickly once before locking on to Jessica's, as if awaiting orders. Jessica drew a slow breath. Her voice, when it came, was low but firm, no different from the commands she used to give on the battlefield. "Sit." The single word seemed to stir something deep within Rex, and his body lowered almost instantly. His front legs folded, haunches settling into the dirt with a precision Jessica hadn't expected to see again so soon. There was a flicker in her eyes, something she couldn't hide, though Sarah beside her stayed calm, only giving a small nod, her approval measured like the seasoned instructor she was. They repeated the drill again and again. Each time, Jessica changed her position, increasing the distance and the challenge of space and response for Rex. The sound of the whistle echoed at regular intervals, steady as a drum beat in an old marching formation. And each time Jessica gave a command, Rex answered. Sometimes there was hesitation. Sometimes the movement wasn't perfect, but the progress was undeniable. When Sarah finally instructed them to move to the next exercise, Jessica gave another whistle blast, then tossed the old rubber ball that Rex had once loved across the yard. Her eyes tracked his every move. For a split second, Rex faltered. His ears dipped for just a moment as if caught in a tug-of-war between memory and fear. Then he broke into a run. There was no panic in his movements, no skittishness in his stride. His claws skimmed lightly over the dry dirt, his muscles flexing fluidly. He snatched the ball up in his jaws and turned back toward Jessica, his breathing rapid but his eyes bright with a confidence she had waited so long to see. When Rex stopped in front of her and gently dropped the ball into Jessica's open palm, his gaze was no longer distant. It was focused, waiting for what came next. "Well done, Rex," Jessica said softly, her hand moving to stroke his head, this time without hesitation, without fear. His fur rippled beneath her touch, and instead of flinching or tensing, Rex stayed still. He even lowered his head slightly, allowing her fingers to move slowly down his spine. Nearby, Sarah smiled faintly, her voice low but clear. "He's coming back." The session ended when the sun rose higher, casting golden light across the cracked brickyard where Kane and Rex now rested side by side, like two old comrades. Jessica watched them for a long moment, something loosening inside her. There were things she could never reclaim from the past. But this moment, Rex lying willingly at her feet, his breathing steady and his eyes half-lidded in peace, was proof that her efforts hadn't been wasted. That night, Jessica carefully placed the whistle and the old ball in the drawer beside her bed. But she knew she'd be taking them out again tomorrow, and the day after that. Each day, she and Rex would take another step, because bonds aren't forged only in blood and battle. They're rebuilt in quiet moments, in small victories, like sitting together in a still yard with the sound of a single whistle and eyes no longer clouded by fear. And this time, Jessica believed they were finally on their way home. Not to where they had lost each other, but to where they would find themselves again. The days following that first training session passed in a slow but hopeful rhythm. Every morning, Jessica worked with Rex, repeating their drills with quiet persistence. The tension that had once gripped every interaction was gone, replaced by a growing sense of partnership, piece by piece, rebuilt from what had once been lost. Each time the whistle sounded, each command, sit, down, fetch, spoken in her steady voice, Rex responded more quickly. His eyes no longer clouded with doubt, but sharp, focused in a way that surprised even her. It was as if fragments of the soldier he once was were slowly coming back together. And Jessica, more than ever, felt the connection between them strengthening again. Solid, trusting. No vows were spoken. No conditions. It simply was. But life rarely warns you when its harshest tests are coming. That morning, after a short session in the yard with Sarah and Kane, Jessica decided to take Rex for a walk through the thin stretch of forest behind the house. The early sunlight filtered through the eucalyptus canopy. The ground was dry again after days of storms, and the crisp air brushing her skin made Jessica feel lighter than she had in years. Rex walked calmly at her side, the leash slack between them, a quiet symbol of the freedom and trust she'd fought to rebuild over these past months. There was no barking, no wary glances over his shoulder, only a warrior, once broken, now walking peacefully beside his comrade. But that peace lasted less than 15 minutes before it was violently torn apart by the deafening roar of a car engine. From the dirt road sloping downhill, an old silver pickup truck, faded and caked with dust, came barreling towards them like an uncontrollable bullet. The steering wheel jerked wildly in the driver's hands, a drunk, whose face Jessica barely registered through the haze of dust and exhaust before instinct forced her to act. But she didn't have time. She hadn't yet moved back or dodged to the side when Rex shot forward like lightning. His thick fur clung tightly to his tense muscles as he threw the full weight of his body into Jessica's side, slamming her out of the path of the speeding truck in a single explosive motion. The sound that followed was bone-chilling, not the impact of metal against the flesh, but the brutal collision of Rex's body, hurled through the air and crashing off the side of the road, tumbling down the rocky embankment. Jessica hit the ground hard, her arm scraped raw, her knee slamming into the dirt, but the physical pain barely registered. She was already scrambling to her feet, launching herself toward Rex without a second's hesitation. She didn't care if the truck had stopped. She didn't hear the distant shouts of a neighbor. The world had narrowed to one thing: Rex, lying motionless at her feet. "Rex!" Jessica's scream tore from her throat as she stumbled toward him. She dropped to her knees, hands fumbling to turn his heavy body over. The war dog who once knew no fear was now limp, his breathing shallow, ragged. Blood seeped from his left side, spreading through his fur and staining the dirt beneath him a dark, ominous red. His golden eyes were barely open, dull with pain and exhaustion. But even now, his tail gave a faint, weak twitch, as if to tell her he didn't regret it, not for a second. Jessica wouldn't let herself cry. There was no time for tears, no space for grief. She slid her arms beneath him, lifting his weight as if it was nothing. Compared to the burdens she had carried before, this was nothing. She ran. Every stride is uneven on the gravel, her breath coming in sharp, desperate bursts, chest tight as if it might tear apart at any moment. She didn't look back. She didn't care about the driver. All she knew was that she had to get Rex to the only place that could help him, Michael Carter's clinic. The door slammed open with a crash, banging against the wall as Jessica barreled through. Blood dripped from her skinned knees, and her raw hands left smears on the doorframe. But none of it mattered, not compared to the weight in her arms. Michael looked up from his desk. His usually calm blue eyes darkened instantly at the sight of Rex. "Over here," he said without hesitation, motioning to the emergency table. Jessica laid Rex down carefully, her hands shaking as Michael immediately began his assessment. His fingers were efficient but gentle, his gaze flicking from wound to wound, from the rising and falling line of Rex's labored breathing to the numbers flashing on the monitors. "Severe chest trauma," Michael muttered under his breath. "Broken ribs, probably punctured lung. He won't make it unless we operate." Now, Jessica already knew. She'd known from the moment she saw Rex lying on the ground. But when Michael hesitated briefly, his expression softening with a rare glimpse of empathy, she realized just how grave the risk was. "This surgery's dangerous, Jess. Odds aren't great. Not with his condition." His words weren't cruel, they were honest. But Jessica's jaw clenched tight, her hands curling into fists until her knuckles turned white. She knew the numbers. She'd seen odds like this before. But when she looked at Rex, saw the faint glimmer of defiance still flickering in his half-closed eyes, she understood there was no choice. Not for her. Not for him. "Do it," she said, her voice hoarse but ironclad. "Whatever it takes. He didn't leave me on that battlefield. I'm not leaving him now." Michael held her gaze for a beat longer, then nodded. He motioned for his assistant, Lisa, to prep the anesthesia and surgical tools. Jessica stayed by Rex's side until the very last moment. Her hand rested gently on his head, her fingers stroking once, slowly, between his ears as the drugs took hold. She leaned in and whispered into his ear the same promise she had made all those years ago. "You saved me once, Rex. Now it's my turn to bring you home." The surgical lights flared to life, bright and clinical. The steady blip of Rex's heart monitor was slow but strong, and as Michael made his first incision, Jessica closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she prayed, not for herself, but for the one who had always stood between her and death. The surgical light cast a blinding halo over Rex's motionless body, making every drop of blood seeping through his dark fur glow even redder under Michael's focused and skillful hands. The scalpel glided through his thick, scarred skin, opening a path toward the most devastating injuries left by the accident, injuries that now held Rex's life suspended by the thinnest thread. Jessica stood silently in the corner of the room, her hands clenched together so tightly they had turned white, her nails digging deep into her skin without her even realizing it. Every sound in the room seemed suffocated by the steady, slow rhythm of Rex's heartbeat echoing from the monitor. Each beep echoed like the heavy ticking of a clock counting down to an uncertain end. She couldn't remember the last time she prayed. Maybe it was that first night when her unit was ambushed in the Rocky Mountains with no backup. Or maybe it was when she and Rex crawled through a minefield to evacuate a wounded teammate, not knowing if they would ever make it out alive. But this time was different. This prayer wasn't for herself or anyone else. It was for Rex, the dog who had survived the war, who had endured wounds no one could see, and who was now fighting for his fragile life right in front of her. Time froze in the operating room as Michael exhaled slowly and tilted his head toward the monitor. He muttered something to Lisa, his voice low and clipped, then carefully stitched up the large tear along Rex's side after adjusting the damaged lung tissue. "He's stable," Michael said quietly, almost to himself. But Jessica heard it, and those words struck her like the first fragile light breaking through after a long, brutal storm. Her legs buckled, and she sank into a chair against the wall, her thin hands trembling as they covered her face. Then, the memories came back, suddenly and fiercely, flooding her mind with images she had spent years avoiding. It was their last mission together, in the desert north of Kunduz, Afghanistan. There was no rain that day, but smoke and dust from gunfire blackened the horizon. They had been ordered to rescue hostages from a village rigged with explosives. Jessica was pointing, holding Rex's leash tightly as he moved ahead of her. The path through the dry grass was a death trap, and it was Rex, with his sharp instincts and flawless training, who stopped just in time to warn her of an undetonated mine buried beneath the loose soil. Without him, she would have stepped on it. She would have died. There would have been no second chance. But Rex had turned to her with those steady, piercing eyes, fearless as if his life existed solely to shield hers. And now, lying silent on the surgical table, it was Jessica who understood more than ever what helplessness felt like, the kind Rex must have known when he stood between her and death. She could do nothing now but wait. There was no rifle in her hands, no map, no backup plan. Only trust, only hope, and the belief that Rex, this warrior, wasn't going to give up. Time seemed to stop. Michael said little, his expression taut with concentration. Lisa monitored the vitals, wiping sweat from Michael's forehead as he worked. The faint snip of scissors, the thread sliding through muscle and flesh. It all sounded like old canvas being slowly torn. Jessica never took her eyes off their movements, even as her heart pounded so hard she thought it might shatter her ribs. And then, finally, Michael exhaled deeply and removed the temporary breathing tube. Jessica knew in that moment the most critical part was over. He glanced at her, his gaze softening, though his tone remained serious. "It's done," Michael said quietly. "Now it's up to him." Jessica stood, slowly crossing the room, and rested a trembling but steady hand on Rex's head. His fur was still warm, his breathing was shallow, but there was a rhythm. She leaned down and whispered, her voice breaking but clear. "You pulled me out of death once, Rex. Now it's my turn to bring you home." It took nearly another hour before Rex showed the first signs of response. His claws shifted faintly against the cold metal table, and gradually his heavy eyelids fluttered, opening slightly to reveal those familiar deep golden eyes. Jessica held her breath, lowering herself until her gaze was level with his. And in that moment, for the first time since they had found each other again at the rescue shelter, those eyes were no longer dull or lost. They were clear, sharp, and full of recognition. Rex looked at her, and it wasn't the empty stare of instinctive survival. It was a look that said he knew exactly who she was. His teammate, the one who had stood beside him in battle, the one he had once risked his life to protect, and now, the one who had just fought for him with everything she had. He took a slow, deep breath, and his ears tilted back gently in an almost comforting gesture, or maybe apologetic, as if to say sorry for making her worry. Jessica laughed, the sound breaking from her chest, raw and shaky. The first time she had laughed in months. Hot tears streamed down her cheeks, not from despair, but from the overwhelming relief crashing through her. She placed her hand on Rex's neck, stroking him gently, feeling every fragile but steady heartbeat beneath her palm. Michael and Lisa quietly stepped out of the room, leaving them alone in the silence. Jessica leaned in closer, whispering into Rex's ear, a promise she now knew she could keep. "We're going home now, Rex. This time no one gets left behind." Rex didn't take his eyes off her, and in that moment, Jessica knew. The miracle she had never dared to believe in had truly happened. Rex had come back, to her and himself. In the days following Rex's life-or-death surgery, life at the small house on the outskirts of the Arizona town slowly settled back into the fragile sense of peace Jessica had worked so hard to preserve. Rex recovered faster than anyone had expected, thanks in part to the resilience forged by years of combat, and in part to Jessica's unwavering care and Michael's meticulous guidance. Mornings were quiet, bathed in soft golden light streaming through the dusty wooden window panes. Rex lay with his chin resting on Jessica's foot, his eyes calmly following her as she made coffee or prepared breakfast, as if there had never been sleepless nights filled with panic or wounds still raw beneath sterile white bandages. Yet Jessica knew, better than anyone, that the deepest scars rarely showed on the surface. And it wasn't just true for Rex, it was true for her as well. But the fragile calm was broken far sooner than she expected. It began with the smallest signs, things no one else would have noticed unless they had lived long enough on the edge of survival. Strange vehicles parked longer than usual on the dirt road in front of her house at dusk. Strangers approached, pretending to ask for directions, but their eyes swept over her property too carefully, lingering too long. And at night, it wasn't the cracking of branches she heard, but footsteps, heavy ones, deliberate in their attempt to stay quiet in the dark. At first, Jessica thought she was being paranoid, maybe still wound too tight from everything that had happened. But when she found the wire fence at the back of the yard neatly cut, there was no room left for doubt. Someone was watching them, and it wasn't out of curiosity. Jessica picked up her phone and sent Sarah a single message. "You need to get here. Now." Less than 3 hours later, Sarah arrived with Kane at the forest's edge. She wore dark tactical gear that had seen its fair share of battle, and her eyes were cold and sharp. Jessica felt a piece of herself relax in a way it hadn't in months. They didn't exchange many words. They didn't need to. They simply shared a look, and then they began sweeping the property together, checking every line of defense as if they were back on a forward operating base, preparing for an assault they knew was coming. That night, Sarah opened her old military laptop, tapping into underground networks she hadn't accessed since her special ops days. Within hours, the pieces fell into place. Cerberus, an international syndicate specializing in the trafficking and resale of retired military working dogs and K9 units. They kidnapped, bought, and retrained dogs like Rex, stripping them of choice and turning them into weapons for underground fights and illegal operations. They exploited their combat instincts and unwavering loyalty, turning them into killers. Now, Cerberus had found Rex. "Looks like Rex's files ended up in their hands," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on the scrolling lines of encrypted code on the screen. "They know exactly what he is. Top-tier combat dog, rescue missions, explosives detection. His record makes him priceless." Jessica's hand tightened around the strap of her sidearm, the weapon she hadn't worn in over a year. Her grip didn't waver. "They won't get the chance," she said, her voice hard as steel. But Sarah shook her head slowly, keeping her tone calm. "Not unless we make a plan." That night, they sat in the living room with the dogs lying close by, alert and tense. Sarah sketched a map of the house and landed on an old board, marking every blind spot, every potential breach point, and every location where Jessica should lay traps and alarms. Kane took point in patrolling the backyard. Rex, though still healing, refused to move from his guard post at the front door. His amber eyes gleamed like sharpened knives. By dawn, Jessica sat on the porch steps, staring into the dense fog that cloaked the tree line. She knew Cerberus wasn't some disorganized gang. They were ex-soldiers. They understood how K9 units worked. They knew the greatest weakness of a combat dog wasn't its body. It was the bond it shared with its handler. Cerberus wanted Rex's skills, but more than that, they wanted to control his loyalty. That was something Jessica could never allow to happen again. Sarah joined her on the steps and handed her a bottle of water. "They played dirty," Sarah said, watching the horizon. "They won't just take Rex. If we're not careful, they'll kill you to make him submit." Jessica nodded, her hand gripping Rex's old leather collar. It was faded, worn down by time and service, but it still felt like a promise. "Then we strike first." That night, protecting Rex wasn't a choice. It was survival. Jessica and Sarah knew Cerberus had brought the ghosts of their past back to life, and this time they would fight, scars and all, not just for Rex, for everything they believed in, everything they had lost, and everything they still had left to fight for. Night settled thick and heavy. Above Jessica's small house, the clouds swallowed the sky, hiding the moon, and any fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this would end without bloodshed. Sarah and Jessica had spent the day preparing, laying traps, testing their makeshift alarm system, finalizing defense plans and exit routes in case things went south. Kane patrolled the rear perimeter, and Rex, despite his wounds, lay silently at the front door, ears pricked, amber eyes watching the dust-choked yard. They waited, and they knew. Cerberus would strike tonight. They were right. Around 2 a.m., an engine growled low through the eastern woods, slow and steady, like a predator's heartbeat, closing in. The truck's tires crunched over the dry dirt road, unhurried but deliberate. They weren't hiding anymore. They wanted to be seen. Jessica tightened her grip on her pistol, finger poised on the trigger. She met Sarah's gaze. A silent message passed between them. No backing down. The sharp snip of bolt cutters cut through the quiet as they snapped the lock on the back gate. Figures in black slipped through the breach they'd made in the fence the night before. They moved fast. Precise. Ex-military, Jessica realized immediately. 2 advanced on the front door. 1 flanked the side. 1 took up a high position, sniper or lookout. These weren't smugglers. These were professionals, hunters. They knew how to break dogs like Rex. Kane gave a low, warning growl. Sarah acknowledged him with a nod. Rex rose without hesitation, a deep snarl rolling from his throat, a final warning before he acted. Jessica locked the window shutters in place. Sarah moved fast, taking her position near the emergency exit. But before they could breach the front door, Rex slammed into it from the inside, shaking the frame. His bark split the night, a sharp crack of defiance that made the intruders hesitate. 1 motioned the others forward. He reached for the handle, but Rex's paw smashed through the weakened wood, his jaws locking on the man's arm. A brutal twist and pull brought the intruder to his knees in seconds. The scream that followed was cut short as Kane lunged from the side, the 2 dogs working in brutal tandem. Sarah fired a warning shot into the air, but the attackers didn't flinch. The sniper opened fire, 1 round slicing the air inches from Jessica's head. The scent of gunpowder mingled with the sharp tang of blood and the splintered wood of the doorframe. Her home, her refuge, had become a war zone. Amid the chaos, Jessica heard an engine roaring down the road, sirens howling behind it. She allowed herself a quick breath of relief. Michael. He hadn't waited. When they lost contact earlier that day, he'd called the police and driven straight to them. He leaped from his truck, shotgun ready, and aimed when he saw Kane and Rex pinning 2 men to the ground. Without a word, he fired a warning shot toward the sniper, forcing him to retreat into the shadows. But the biggest surprise came from where Jessica least expected it. Another gunshot rang out, but this time from behind the house. A familiar figure emerged from the line of eucalyptus trees, gripping an old Winchester rifle with steady hands, his narrowed eyes sharp with focus. Hank. The gruff, difficult neighbor Jessica had long thought would never stand on her side was now stepping into the fight like an old soldier returning to a familiar firing position. Without a word of explanation, he chambered another round, squeezed the trigger, and shot down a man who was attempting to slip through the kitchen window. "I'm not going to sit around and watch that damn dog die trying to protect you," Hank said, his voice rough and low. He didn't turn to look at her, but Jessica could hear the emotion buried in every word rasping out of his parched throat. "He's a soldier, just like you. I owe him something." Moments later, the police arrived. Sirens wailed and blue and red lights flashed, cutting through the tense darkness. Cerberus realized the balance had shifted. Those who could still run tried to flee, but found themselves caught in the tightening perimeter of the local patrol units. Sarah and Kane secured the 2 men they'd taken down in the yard. Michael held his position, shotgun ready, his eyes sweeping for any signs of further threat. Jessica dropped to her knees beside Rex, her hand running down the length of his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing through his warm fur. In the strobe of flashing lights and shouts, Jessica watched as Hank came closer. He knelt beside Rex, his old eyes glossy but stubbornly refusing to release any tears. He rested his hand on the dog's head, gently stroking it as one might an old friend, and muttered under his breath, "Good job, kid. Just like back in the army." That night, after everything had quieted and the Cerberus operatives were hauled away in chains, Jessica sat on the front steps of the house. Rex lay beside her, his head resting on her leg. Sarah sat across from her, Kane pressed close against her shoulder. Hank and Michael shared a cigarette, and passed between them an old bottle of whiskey, like soldiers who had survived too many wars to speak of it anymore. No one talked about the injuries, the near misses, or the deaths that had come so close. They simply sat there, quiet and watchful, guarding a fragile peace. This time, though, it was a peace they had fought for together, and one they intended to keep. As the night retreated, leaving behind the lingering scent of gunpowder in the damp air, Jessica didn't allow herself to relax for even a moment. Though the Cerberus operatives had been pushed back, thanks to the timely arrival of Michael, Hank, and the local police, both she and Sarah knew exactly what kind of predators they were dealing with. Cerberus wouldn't retreat without leaving a final bite. While some of them had been handcuffed and hauled away, others were still lurking in the shadows, planning their next assault. And this time, Jessica wasn't going to sit back and wait for it. Sarah had seen it in the curt nod Jessica gave her as they both ran final checks on their weapons and gear before dawn broke. No unnecessary words, no romanticizing this fight, just the kind of sharp coordination between two veterans who had once stood shoulder to shoulder on the deadliest front lines. They both knew survival wasn't enough. They had to finish it. And this time, they would. With data Sarah had pulled from underground comms networks and mobile signal trackers, they pinpointed the leader of the Cerberus group, a mercenary known as Vulture. He was a seasoned hunter of military dogs, capturing and selling them into brutal underground fight circuits. Ruthless and tactically sharp, his involvement in last night's assault proved one thing: Rex was his most valuable target yet. Jessica tightened her grip on the stock of her rifle, her gaze locked on the map Sarah had spread across the table. She studied the mark that indicated Cerberus's current hideout, a derelict warehouse tucked in a southern valley, once a military firing range now long abandoned. Time was running out. According to the intercepted signals, Sarah predicted Cerberus would retreat at first light if they failed to capture Rex. That meant their guards would be down as they packed up to move. Their only shot was to strike fast, sever their escape, and corner them before they could react. Jessica, Sarah, Kane, and Rex loaded into the truck as dawn smeared pale light across the horizon. The air inside the cabin was thick with the metallic tang of gun oil and the heavy breathing of both soldier and dog. From the back seat, Rex stared at Jessica in the rearview mirror. His gaze was sharp, steady. He was ready for a battle neither of them had ever wanted to fight again. When they reached the valley, Sarah laid out the assault plan like they had done countless times before. Jessica would take Rex and cut off their escape from the rear, while Sarah and Kane would lead the frontal assault. Every movement was precise, a well-oiled machine that didn't need instructions to know what to do. Jessica moved low, slipping between rows of rusted metal crates, one hand tight on her rifle's trigger. Rex moved beside her, each step silent, smooth. No wasted energy, no hesitation. When they reached the rear door of the warehouse, Jessica's earpiece crackled with Sarah's steady voice. 10 seconds. Jessica smirked, a flicker of anticipation burning through her tension. She gave Rex the signal, palm open, 3 fingers raised just like they used to do back in the desert. 3, 2, 1. The door flew open with a crash. Sarah and Kane stormed in from the front, gunfire thundering through the confined space. Outside, Jessica dropped low and fired 2 precise shots, taking down the guards posted at the rear. Then she gestured to Rex. He surged forward like a live round, swift and deadly. No barking, just the scrape of claws on cement and the low, guttural growl deep in his throat as he closed in on the target. Vulture didn't stand a chance. He barely turned, one hand fumbling for the pistol on his hip before Rex hit him like a freight train. Jaws clamped down on his arm, yanking him off balance. Rex's bite pulverized muscle and joint in seconds, sending the weapon clattering uselessly to the floor. Jessica was there in an instant, the butt of her rifle slamming into Vulture's temple with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the ground. Sarah covered the other flank, dropping another Cerberus thug who'd tried to come at Jessica with a knife. She signaled the police response team moving in from the main road. Sirens wailed. Red and blue strobes cut through the murky dust and smoke as SWAT officers poured into the warehouse, overwhelming the remaining Cerberus fighters before they could regroup. As the smoke cleared and the air finally settled, the crackle of radios and the ragged breathing of survivors replaced the chaos. Jessica sat back on the concrete floor, resting a hand on Rex's head as he stood over Vulture's unconscious form. "Good job, soldier," she murmured. Her voice was low but filled with pride. Rex turned to look at her, his eyes fierce yet calm. He knew, as she did, the fight was over. Sarah approached, yanking out her earpiece and tossing her helmet aside. Kane trailed after her, his coat streaked with dust and the blood of their enemies. They exchanged no words. They didn't need to. They had won. Not just the raid on Cerberus's stronghold, but the war against their past. The demons that had told them they wouldn't survive. Vulture lay in cuffs, blood trickling from his wrists, his eyes still burning with hate. Jessica crouched beside him, her gaze ice cold. "You dragged us through hell," she said, her voice rough as gravel. "But don't forget, we came back." Morning light slipped through the gaps in the warehouse walls, illuminating bloodstains and old scars alike. But this time, it wasn't a place for darkness to hide. Jessica, Sarah, Rex, and Kane had fought their way to freedom, not just for themselves, but for every soldier left behind. And in the silence after the fight, they all knew this war was finally over. That morning, dawn came slower than usual. Pale sunlight filtered through the eucalyptus trees, casting a muted yellow-gray glow over the ground, as if the land itself was still recovering from the storm. Not just the one in the sky, but the one carried by those marked with old scars. The warehouse, once thought by Cerberus to be an impenetrable fortress, was now just another ruined battlefield. It stood as evidence of the relentless counterattack from the night before. Jessica sat quietly on the front steps of her small house, her calloused hand wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. Her gaze followed Rex, who moved slowly through the front yard, sniffing the grass as if discovering it for the first time. This was home now. Truly home. His wound along his side had been carefully stitched by Michael. More precise, more delicate than any field job Jessica had seen back in the war. But what gave her real peace was the look in Rex's eyes. The dark, golden gaze no longer seemed lost, but steady and aware. He wasn't searching for escape routes anymore. He was present. Sarah and Kane had left town at first light, leaving behind a few parting words. This time there was a rare lightness to them. Michael had returned to his clinic after ensuring Rex was stable, and Jessica knew his quiet optimism wasn't just about the dog's recovery. It was about hers, too. But the person she least expected to see that morning was Hank. She heard him before she saw him. The slow, deliberate crunch of his boots on hard earth. When she looked up, there he was, carrying an old, beaten-up toolbox. Jessica recognized it right away. It was the one he never loaned to anyone. He wasn't dressed in his usual hunting gear, but in a faded denim work shirt and heavy canvas pants. He didn't look like the gruff ex-soldier she'd argued with so many times before, but like an old craftsman who had finally decided to repair something that mattered. Hank stopped at the gate, staring at her in silence for a long few seconds. Then he nodded toward the fence that had been broken during the attack. "That dog of yours needs a stronger boundary," he said, his voice as raspy as ever. But there was something different in it now, almost like concern. "I don't like owing people, especially not the ones who saved my life." Jessica stood, setting her coffee down on the windowsill. She walked over as he opened the toolbox and pulled out neatly sanded planks of wood and coiled steel wire, materials ready for a fight of their own. She didn't offer thanks, didn't waste words. She just picked up the hammer and worked beside him. They didn't need conversation. Their rhythm, the steady pounding of nails, was enough, like soldiers who knew how to share silence without discomfort. Rex lay nearby, watching them. Occasionally he'd lift his head when Hank stepped back to measure the line of the fence, and every time he did, Hank's gaze flickered toward him, not with suspicion anymore, but with a kind of quiet respect. By late morning, the last nail was hammered in. Hank straightened, brushing sawdust off his pants, his gaze sweeping over the yard now restored to order. Then, as if he suddenly remembered something, he walked back to his truck and returned with an object that made Jessica's breath catch. It was an old rocking chair. The wood was worn smooth, its mahogany finish faded by years of sun and weather. But its craftsmanship was unmistakable. Every joint was handmade, every curve shaped by someone who had cared. She knew right away it had belonged to his late wife. Hank never spoke of her, not once since the day she died. He set the chair on her porch, adjusting its position carefully before stepping back with his arms crossed over his chest. "She used to sit there," he said flatly. "Watched the dogs run around the yard. Thought maybe you'd need it more than I do now." Jessica ran her fingers along the cool wood, tracing its smoothness like it was something fragile. She could hear everything he wasn't saying, buried beneath those few simple words. She nodded. "Thank you, Hank," she murmured and sat down. The chair moved easily, back and forth, its steady rhythm grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. Rex came closer, laying his head across her knee. His breathing was slow and relaxed. Hank watched for a moment, then gave a curt nod before turning back toward his truck. He didn't say another word, but there was something calm in the way he walked away, as if a burden had lifted. That afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the trees, gleaming off the new fence and the gently rocking chair, Jessica realized something important. Victory wasn't just about taking down an enemy or surviving another fight. It was about reconciliation, about rediscovering trust in the smallest things: a sturdy fence, an old chair left behind by someone loved, and the softened gaze of a man who had once been nothing but harsh edges. And with Rex resting quietly at her feet, no longer afraid, Jessica realized that, at last, they had truly come home. After that night, filled with smoke and gunfire, Jessica's life was no longer the same. Everything had changed, from the way she slept without jolting awake in the middle of the night to the quiet peace she once thought was lost forever. But the most profound change wasn't within herself. It was in the meaning that Rex, Sarah, Emily, Michael, and everyone who had fought beside her now gave to the rest of her days. As time passed, Jessica realized that she and Rex were not the only ones carrying invisible scars from the war. There were still many other veterans like her, struggling to find their place in a world that seemed to have moved on without them. And not just people. The war dogs like Rex, once loyal and fearless, had become forgotten soldiers too. Silent warriors, bearing wounds that were slow to heal, both in body and spirit. Jessica knew she had to do something, not only for Rex, but for herself, and for those lost souls she had once counted herself among. Emily was the first to place a hand on Jessica's shoulder one warm morning. They were sitting together on the old rocking chair Hank had given them, watching Rex resting quietly on the porch. Emily's eyes held a light Jessica hadn't seen before. "You can't live in memories forever, Jess," Emily said gently, her hand tightening around her sister's. "It's time to turn those memories into something that matters." And that's how Hope and Pause was born. At first it was just a vague idea, a therapy center for wounded veterans and their military dogs. But with Emily's unwavering determination, Michael's expertise, and Hank's quiet but vital support, The idea quickly became a living, breathing space full of hope. Hank, though he never admitted it, donated nearly all the land behind his old farm, where he had lived in solitude for years after his wife's death. Michael wasn't just the veterinarian. He was the heart of the rehabilitation clinic for the dogs, tending to the most complex injuries and helping the animals who once trembled in dark cages learn to trust human hands again. Jessica was the founder, but also its living symbol of renewal. She trained the wounded dogs, helping them rediscover their sense of safety and guiding them back, step by step, to a life of companionship. Rex became an irreplaceable teacher. His presence, his resilience, was a promise to every four-legged soul that life could begin again, no matter the past. In those first days, Rex patiently led frightened dogs into the training yard, waiting for them to respond to simple commands, sit, down, follow, before helping them take on harder challenges. No one could forget the moment Rex allowed a younger shepherd, abandoned after a failed mission, to rest its head on his shoulder. It was an image Jessica would never forget. Proof that no wound was beyond healing. Emily managed the mental health programs. Therapeutic gardens bloomed with medicinal herbs and calming flowers, designed as plant therapy spaces. Here, veterans and their canine partners worked side by side, learning to slow down, nurture new life, and, most importantly, feel themselves as part of a cycle no longer defined by death and destruction. Michael created rehabilitation programs that blended physical therapy and traditional medicine, offering comprehensive care for severely wounded war dogs. He also trained the center's future handlers, the veterans who came to Hope and Pause, seeking not only to reclaim themselves, but also to find new companionship. Rex was always there as a trainer's assistant, his steady, confident gaze helping even the most broken soldiers rediscover hope. Kane and Sarah returned often, not just as warriors, but as mentors. They shared stories no one else dared to tell about the long nights on the battlefield, and they helped establish the psychological support programs for combat veterans. Sarah often said, "War doesn't end when the guns go silent. It ends when the last soldier finds a way to lay down their weapon without fear." Rex no longer belonged to Jessica alone. He became the center's emblem, a warrior who had come back from the brink and found a new life. A small statue of Rex was erected in front of the center, beneath it a brass plaque engraved with the words, "The one who never gave up." It was a message for everyone who passed through Hope and Pause gates, whether human or canine. On long days, Jessica sat on Hank's late wife's rocking chair, watching Rex and the younger dogs train in the yard. There was a peace in her that she had never believed she'd feel again. She knew the nightmares might return, and the scars would always be there, but they no longer defined her. Just as Rex had overcome his pain to lead others, Jessica had found her path. No longer a lost soldier, but someone who gave hope. Hope and Pause was more than a therapy center. It was a home, a new beginning for anyone who thought they had lost everything. And Jessica knew the journey was only just beginning. The tireless days working at Hope and Pause passed like a slow-motion film. For Jessica, every small step forward made by the veterans and the war dogs at the center was its quiet victory, one that needed no gunfire or loud slogans. She had grown used to this life, simple, steady, no longer haunted by the past. But when Emily walked into her office one afternoon, holding an official letter bearing the national seal, her eyes glistening with emotion she couldn't hide, Jessica realized there were some things she could no longer avoid: recognition and honor for herself, for Rex, and for the journey they had shared. The letter was from the National Council for Veterans Affairs and the Combat K-9 Unit. It invited Jessica to attend a ceremony honoring outstanding veterans and war dogs, an event dedicated to those who had quietly sacrificed so much for their country. This time she wasn't just an attendee. She was the keynote speaker. Michael and Emily encouraged her to accept, but it was Rex who decided for her. He gently took the invitation envelope in his mouth and nudged it toward her, as if to say, "It's time to tell our story." On the day of the ceremony, Jessica put on her old uniform. It had been carefully pressed after years stored away, still fitting perfectly despite the frayed seams and faded metals. Wearing it was like carrying her past with her, all the pride, the loss, and the uncountable weight of memory. Rex walked at her side, wearing a green olive lead embroidered with his name and the insignia of the Special Forces unit they had served in. Sarah had made it for him on the first day of their recovery journey. The hall was illuminated by skylights, dazzling under the stage lights as Jessica stepped up. Applause rose like a wave from the crowd. She took a deep breath, her hand resting on Rex's head to steady herself. Then she looked out over the sea of faces. Veterans who had faced the same darkness, women like Emily who had endured silent waiting, and children who were listening with bright eyes, still innocent, but deeply curious. "There are wounds," Jessica began, her voice steady in a way she hadn't expected, "that you can't see." She paused, her gaze falling on Rex, whose ears pricked up as if listening to every word. "I am a veteran, and I carried those wounds for many years, thinking they were something I had to hide just to survive. But I was wrong." Her voice was calm, but carried the weight of truth as she told them about the nights she spent trapped in nightmares, the days she shut herself away in the darkness, and then the day she found Rex again, in that rescue shelter, how his once bright eyes had dulled. She spoke about the night of the storm, when Rex had run, but come back in time to save a lost child from a pack of wolves, how in that moment she understood that hope never truly dies. The room was silent, hanging on every word. She spoke of hope and pause, of the soldiers and dogs who came there broken but found a way to heal, breath by breath, step by step. Rex had taught her a truth no commander ever mentioned on the battlefield. Courage isn't just standing in a firefight. It's the choice to trust again, to love and be loved, even after everything has broken you. Jessica ended her speech with her hand resting on Rex's head, her voice low but full of strength. "He showed me that." The silence lingered for a moment longer before the entire room erupted into applause, loud, lasting, and overwhelming. Tears slid down the faces of weathered veterans. Mothers held their children tightly. Young soldiers returning from recent tours stood straighter in their seats. They weren't just applauding Jessica or Rex. They were honoring every battle fought by those who had given pieces of their soul to their country. Later, Rex was awarded the Combat K-9 Medal of Honor, a silver medallion engraved with his unit and the words, "Fidelity and Courage." Jessica clipped it onto his collar, and Rex lifted his head high, his eyes shining under the bright lights. Without a word, he strode forward to the podium, sitting calmly at her side, as if the honor belonged to them both. Jessica understood then that this moment wasn't the end of their journey. It was a reminder that recovery is ongoing, but she wasn't afraid anymore. Rex was with her, and wherever there were people in need of healing, they would walk forward together. The ceremony came and went, but the echo of applause and the weight of so many grateful eyes lingered in Jessica's memory. She had never sought praise, nor did she desire medals or awards. What mattered was the journey she and Rex had shared, one of loss, resilience, and ultimately forgiveness and healing. After the ceremony, she returned to hope and pause, to the rhythm of everyday life where new stories of survival and recovery were being written. That afternoon, as soft golden sunlight filtered through the eucalyptus trees behind the center, Jessica felt an old, familiar pull, a quiet calling, like the heartbeat she once heard before deploying. Without overthinking, she grabbed Rex's lead, fastened his familiar collar around his neck, and together they walked toward the western hills above the town. It was the same place where, years ago, she had stood wondering if she would ever return. The path to the hilltop wasn't as rough as it had once been. She and Emily had added flat stone steps for aging veterans and their dogs to climb more easily. But Jessica didn't take that path. She led Rex along the old dirt trail winding around the hillside, the one they both knew by heart. Wild lavender and soft grass brushed against their legs, and their footsteps blended with the wind. Each step was measured, steady, as though their hearts beat in perfect time. At the summit, the sun was sinking behind distant mountains, casting red-gold light over the valley. Below, the lights of homes flickered on. Hope and Pause gleamed faintly under the evening sky, its rooftops and gardens visible in the fading light. She saw silhouettes of veterans walking dogs in the yards, simple and peaceful, worth more than any medal she had ever earned. Jessica sat down on an old stone slab, her hand tracing the rough surface that had once felt cold and lonely. Rex settled beside her, shifting his weight before lifting his head to meet her gaze. His golden eyes reflected the fading sunset, no longer shadowed by fear or haunted by the past. Only calm remained, as if he too knew the war was truly over. She ran her hand through the coarse fur at his neck, now streaked with gray. She could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his breath under her palm, a warmth she once thought she didn't deserve. Leaning in close to his ear, she whispered the truth that had lived in her heart for so long. "We're still comrades, Rex." Her voice soft and warm. "And we always will be. Forever." Rex didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he shifted closer, resting his chin on her leg, the familiar weight grounding her in the moment. His eyes closed halfway as he exhaled deeply, letting go of whatever burdens still lingered. Jessica sat still beside him, letting the peace settle over them. She had believed once that this peace was only for others, not for a soldier like her. But now the battles within her were over. The fear had burned away like morning mist under the sun. For the first time, she saw a future untouched by regret. She lifted her gaze to the sky, where stars were beginning to appear. They shone sharp and clear, like the best memories she and Rex had made together. Every scar on Rex's body, every breath he took beside her, and every breeze through the wild grass at their feet carved one undeniable truth. They had survived. They had fought. And more importantly, they had found themselves again. No vows are needed, no chains to bind them. Their comradeship was eternal, written in loyalty, courage, and the quiet love shared by those who had stood together at the edge of death and come back. Darkness crept over the valley, but on that hilltop, between Jessica and Rex, there was a quiet light no sunset or nightfall could ever dim. It was the light of complete healing, the end of a long, painful journey. And together, they sat in silence as the stars came out. Comrades forever, forever part of each other. And so they sat together in silence on that hilltop, watching the horizon until only the stars remained as their companions. Forever comrades, forever a part of each other. The journey of Jessica and Rex came to an end on that peaceful hill, where they found healing after years of battles fought not only on distant fields, but deep within their hearts. And what about you? Do you have a story about a loyal four-legged companion who changed your life? Share it with us in the comments below. We would love to hear about your incredible journey and welcome you into a community of hearts dedicated to love and healing. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share this video with someone who might need a little hope, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss other moving stories about friendship, loyalty, and the extraordinary will to live. We'll see you on the next journey.